Welcome, everyone, to the webinar on policy promotion and push for patients. This is really a wonderful conversation to have. When we first started PPMD in 1994, there were no clinical trials, none whatsoever. And so having this conversation now, not only about the clinical trials, but about approvals and access, is really an important one. So as PPMD began to think about this in the past few years, we wanted to really envision a comprehensive strategy to look at the regulatory aspects of drug approval, drug development and approval, but also to look beyond that to approvals and what do labels say and who is the label inclusive. As you all know, the 6-minute walk test is the primary outcome of many of these studies. So we want to make sure that the agency understands this high unmet need and is able to extrapolate or willing to extrapolate from the cohort of patients that are studied to enable all boys who fit into a certain strategy, whether that's an exon or whether that's a more general strategy such as myostatin or the Cialis drug or whatever, so that all young men have access, and some of the girls as well would have access to these therapies, and that the payers or people who are going to be reimbursing these drugs will in fact do that for all patients, no matter what stage of the disease. So to that end, we've developed a comprehensive strategy to look at that. First, our board developed a policy within the framework of the regulatory agenda, and following that, we really thought about what to do and had several interactions and continue to have them with the agency and the Division of Neurology. During some of those conversations of discussion of what is needed here, the neurology division suggested that while they understood the risk-benefit equation was different in Duchenne than in common disorders, they really didn't have any data. And in public comment, the agency has often been known to say, in God we trust, but all other people must bring data. So we responded to that request and created and envisioned a survey instrument working with Dr. John Bridges from Johns Hopkins to develop a survey instrument that we would begin to collect data around benefit-risk. So today we're really going to look at all of those issues. What have we done? Where are we going? Why are we going there? And the end goal is to include and make sure all boys, no matter what stage of the disease, have access to these very promising, we think, opportunities that we hope to see approvals in the very near future. So with that, I'm going to introduce Tim Franson. Tim is part of our FA Grade B and D team. As you all know, we've been heavily involved in advocacy for the last more than 10 years, and Tim serves on our team as the regulatory consultant of the team, and he has widespread expertise leading regulatory affairs for Eli Lilly. So with that, Tim, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you.
Thanks very much, Pat, and really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share perspectives as well as hear the questions that you all may have in regard to what's happening in improvements in drug development, regulatory transformation. These are indeed exciting and challenging times, and as Pat's outlined, the complexity of this process really means that there are no quick fixes. It really is going to take a long march with many steps, but lots of progress has been made. And I think PPMD has done some remarkable things in distinguishing itself from others who are just demanding action, which is very reasonable, but also by adding value. So we want to talk about how is this value-added process becoming something that the FDA can rely upon and that others may look to as an appropriate pathway to make progress. So I'd like to talk about several features in this regard. First, a little definition and framing, a background, if you will, about drug development and patient access, and then stages in the DTAP, and I'm going to keep you in suspense for about 1 minute as we get to the definition at that point, and then talk a little bit about the policy promotion and push efforts that PPMD has put forward in a very thoughtful, multi-year, multi-step type approach. And then we'll talk about where do we go from here, and be very pleased after my comments to turn things over to Holly P.A. from PPMD to talk about this very thoughtful and forward-moving process of a benefit-risk survey of parents. So without further ado, what are we talking about in terms of policy, promotion, and push? And essentially, policy are just the rules relating to drug development and drug access. Obviously, one needs to understand the rules as is so that we can best understand how do you make suggestions for changing them for the better, for patient interest. When we use the term, secondly, about promotion, we're talking about how do we raise the visibility of these issues to the folks who are making decisions. Then third, what's the push, if you will? Beyond just raising visibility, how do we bring data about patient views on benefit and risk and other matters to individuals who are making decisions, like FDA, but also others, so that they understand patient and parent viewpoints. So just a very broad brush background about drug development, if you will, and it is not to go into all the details. Many of you are familiar with this, and it goes without saying it's very complex. So to just reinforce the comment already made, one is not really able to make this process go faster and more efficiently without a lot of thoughtful steps in the process. And I would call your attention to the bottom of this slide where, as you see, when you add up the time from when a scientist has a really good idea in the laboratory to the time that a new drug may come on the market, takes about 10 to 15 years and lots of steps in clinical trials, even in rare diseases. So how do we understand that whole flow of things and best intervene to improve every step in the process for all patients who may be afflicted, as with Duchenne muscular dystrophy? So let's talk about this DTAP, if you will, as the second step. And it stands for the Duchenne Therapy Accelerations and Access Project. And this is something that PPMD has developed as a coordinated, multi-year plan with many steps, a multi-pronged approach to regulators, to access, to other elements that can be influenced in policy to help engage all stakeholders possible, ideally in a collaboration. So that's what is being done. How it is being done is through thoughtful, constructed steps for what we've termed assertive collaboration. So working together with FDA and others, and doing so in a very firm and positively directed manner, with each of these steps being interconnected so they can build on each other. And if you will, it's the Stephen Covey model of beginning with the end in mind. And that end in mind is no child left behind. How do we best advocate for changes in policy and processes that benefit all children possible? So in that regard, what have been some of the steps in this process? Some you're very familiar with, and some many of you participate in, and will continue to be. That is, in advocating for funding for basic research through the National Institutes of Health and otherwise. And then what has happened beyond that? I'd like to talk a little bit further about these following steps, which are very important in advocating for drug development improvements, and how do we go beyond just saying, please help, but by saying we'd like to help in return with FDA and others. So those advocacy for drug development improvements have really taken several key steps. One is initially about a year and a half plus ago that the board of PPMD came forward with a series of policy proposals that could be used in interactions with FDA and others. And that then led to 2 meetings and soon to be a third with the relevant FDA leadership who review projects for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but also those looking at broader policy matters. And the purpose of those sessions have been to advise FDA colleagues about what is going on in the Duchenne community and to listen to them about what would be important to FDA in hearing from patients other than we need action, but how can we help to begin to move those actions forward. And that has then led to what many of you are familiar with in the white paper by PPMD for putting patients first. And the themes in all of these, the board proposal, the FDA sessions, and the white paper have all centered on 4 critical strategies that we'll get to in a moment, which really lay the groundwork for what we'll be talking about through the remainder of this hour, providing information, data, which, as Pat already told you, is the primary motivating force for FDA and other governmental bodies who have to make decisions. And providing data about benefit risk is probably the most immediate and the most compelling way to provide information to FDA. So that's going to be a major focus of what we talk about here going forward. But let's talk just for a moment about what those platform planks are, if you will, in the program that PPMD's board put forward and has been carried through in the FDA meeting. What has been the driving force for that, and what really makes a difference? And we're going to talk about the fact that PPMD has used its internal advocacy plans to play into previously existing programs, like the Prescription Drug User Fee Act and the important role PPMD played in new provisions to benefit patients with rare diseases, and how PPMD has established a leadership role in not only making those policy changes, but being the first to capitalize on those policy changes to make a difference. So let's talk about some of those particular points. The board position put forward really emphasized 4 important ways to look forward and improve drug development and access processes. The first is expanding the use of accelerated approval for therapies to treat DMD and other rare diseases. Second, to expand the scope of acceptable endpoints for those trials. How do we get to more novel surrogate measures or more established and validated mainstream measures? Third, to ask FDA to use existing authority to pilot the use of adaptive approvals for unmet needs, and the vehicle for adaptive or other approvals is BenefitRisk. And then fourth and finally, to give greater weight to demonstrated benefit risk preferences of patients and caregivers, using existing legislation as a springboard to develop further progress measures. And those same 4 points have been reemphasized and expanded on in the recent white paper, Putting Patients First. So that was aligning things internally, building on that to use these externally with FDA and others. And maybe a very quick background of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA, how that came to being, and it was because of patient efforts, and how that can be used further by PPMD and others for very positive developments. Without going into great detail, the AIDS epidemic was one of several major driving forces in having FDA reconsider how it could structure its review processes. Drugs for AIDS, drugs for depression, which at that point were a huge unmet need, were averaging 3 years review time at FDA once the critical trials were done. And that clearly was not acceptable to patients or to FDA, but they struggled under a lack of resources. So rather than saying, just do more with what you've got, FDA and industry and Congress were able to reach understandings to say companies would provide fees for applications, which did not guarantee approvals. What it guaranteed was more staff to review at FDA, to review more applications in timely fashion. And that led to the first Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which has since been built on by being reauthorized every 5 years. And that process has been focused primarily on speeding up the time from a drug application to a decision about it. Again, it doesn't mean an approval. It may mean a faster time frame for a request for more studies, or perhaps that it doesn't meet FDA's standards for new agents in terms of safety and effectiveness. And this next slide illustrates that with every PDUFA renewal has been a stair-stepping for new improvements. And this parallels PPMD's approach to let's stair-step on what already exists to help us create the foundation for new programs, which you'll hear about again with BenefitRisk. One of the reasons BenefitRisk is so important is that with each PDUFA, there's been increasing attention on safety. And in fact, on PDUFA 4, which was reauthorized in 2007, there were broad new powers provided to FDA on oversight of safety. So with that, the importance of balancing information collected about both benefits and risk is very important moving forward, and created the basis for what needed to be done in PDUFA 5. But just to re-summarize, what's happened in that first 20 years of PDUFA? It was enacted to bring safe and effective new medicines to Americans more quickly. Most parties, even critics, agree that PDUFA 1 and 2 were very effective. It improved speed to market, and interestingly, all studies to date have not shown any increased safety risk to patients as a result of these processes. That is, there's no increase in the rate of safety withdrawals. The process remains very solid, and that the new authorities in PDUFA 4 probably have impacted drug development time negatively, at least somewhat, and therefore needed to be rethought. So the process, as it was renewed in 2012, PDUFA 5 was embedded in a broader act called the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, FDASIA, which included PDUFA, but also some new important provisions. And I highlight here at the bottom of that box on the right of your slide, PPMD's role in shaping this legislation, especially relating to new provisions for rare diseases and improvements in benefit risk. And you can see citations of Pat and others' advocacy in congressional record documents if you wish to read up on more specifics. I realize that you don't want to talk about all the points in legislation. When I do that with scientific audiences, many people fall asleep. But let's focus on the things that wake us up and say, what grand opportunity for the rare diseases community in general and for PPMD and DMD patients in particular. Of the 11 titles or sections in the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, I call your attention to number 9, the drug approval and patient access processes. This is where PPMD played an important role in talking about improvements needed in collaborating with NORD and others. And to really double click on that, in that drug approval and patient access section, there were 4 critical aspects for our discussion, one of which we're going to really drill down on with Holly's comments. But those were improvements in accelerated approval, very consistent with the goals articulated by PPMD's board. New criteria for breakthrough therapies to get FDA to adopt collaboratively new ways of approaching with sponsors true breakthroughs. Third, empowering more input from rare disease experts and others to FDA. And finally, and perhaps most significantly, the framework for benefit risk programs. There are all sorts of other interesting points in this as well, and time doesn't allow us to go through that. But I think the benefit risk piece is important because how FDA approaches new drug applications by looking at benefit risk was sometimes variable across disease areas. And so, as you'll see highlighted here under the third bullet, consistent, balanced approaches to decision-making were something that would be very important as an advancement. And FDA is required by that legislation to develop those kinds of consistent, balanced approaches. And FDA has described the way they really think about benefit risk is by a process that is highlighted in this table. They look at every new drug application for rare or common diseases, and they say there's 5 important things. What's the condition like? In other words, is the process by which the disease occurs well understood or not? Then what is the unmet need? Are there therapies available and there's more or less urgency of time for those patients? What are the clinical benefits and how do you measure them? Are they specific and measurable, or are they more qualitative and harder to understand sometimes? What are the known and potentially unknown risks with each of those medicines? And then fifth, if risks exist, are there ways to make those risks less for patients by means of monitoring programs, be it blood tests or x-rays or whatever? And then FDA looks at each of those factors and says, how much evidence do we have? And are we protecting the public health? And do we have enough evidence to say there's a reasonable hope of effectiveness? And then they put down their conclusions for each of these things and decide, is there enough overall to say that the benefits outweigh the risks? So given that, part of that program in measuring benefit risks under the new legislation is something called patient-focused drug development. And FDA has agreed to hold a series of public meetings on what they've identified as 20 different disease areas. A number of them are not rare diseases. And as such, the more we learned about these programs, the more we realized much of this is going to be FDA listening and learning. And including and beyond these patient-focused drug development sections and sessions, was there any way for PPMD to actually have more impact by providing more information about how patients and parents view benefit and risk? So that leads us to the patient input process. What can we tell you about that has framed our considerations of benefit and risk? This slide I'm now showing you that is titled FDA Perspective actually comes from FDA's website, and I have not altered it in any way. And FDA is just pointing out that they evaluate the benefits and risks of a new drug or an even approved drug from a population perspective. Patients evaluate the benefit and risks in terms of personal values, and physicians and other healthcare providers look at benefit risks in terms of what do they know about a population and how does it fit with an individual patient. The more information that groups of patients can provide about their views on benefit risks, the more it can inform FDA's thinking about how they will measure benefit and risk in new drug development. And so in these patient-focused drug development processes, FDA has already had one hearing, and we are watching these very closely because each one helps us understand better how they are looking at other diseases like chronic fatigue syndrome, which was the topic of the first hearing, and how they might be asking questions about benefit and risk in other diseases, and how that helps us advance our understanding for Duchenne. So moving forward, what are these benefit risk approaches that we're talking about, and how will they build on each step to better advantage patients in the drug development process? So what is benefit? Essentially, that's favorable effects. And FDA and physicians would ask, so how do you measure those effects? And are these effects meaningful to patients and caregivers? And risks are essentially unfavorable effects. Putting those together, an integrated benefit risk consideration, it becomes the critical decision point for new drugs. So why benefit risk? Well, if you think about it, when physicians sit down with the patient, they never talk about risks only, and they never talk about benefits only. It's what does this mean to you? What might be some of the upsides and downsides? And how do we learn more about this? So this entire benefit risk survey process is really a platform for gathering more information about how patients and parents look at the expectations for benefits, what's really important to you. And then on the risk side, perhaps Is FDA looking at things too conservatively? Would patients and parents tolerate a different range of risks based on what your experience has been? And that's pretty darn important. And just to reiterate, FDA just published what's called their structured approach to benefit risk, their plan from 2013 to 2017. And the bottom line there is highlighted in red at the bottom of the slide. Benefit risk assessment is the basis of FDA's regulatory decisions in pre-market and post-market review process. So if we want to have impact, we need to focus on what they focus on and to provide them information that informs that. And this is a slide that was actually taken from FDA as well. Dr. John Jenkins is the leader of the Office of New Drugs, a very thoughtful individual, a physician, and he shared in this slide what are regulators thinking about when they look at a new drug application. And they think about, if you just take this left column, they think about adverse event information. How well was a clinical trial designed? How will these results be communicated? Are there different products in the same class that have been approved, and do they have risks that mean further safety reviews need to be undertaken, and similar matters? But if you look at all of these small blue boxes, most of them relate to either benefit or risk, and a lot more related to risk than the benefit side. So how do we assure there's a balanced attention to these matters? Well, by providing more information, and that really means patient-reported outcomes. That's something that's likely going to be growing out of these patient-focused drug development hearings. That information will help influence the thinking of scientists at FDA and elsewhere. And it is the focus of a pending white paper that PPMD is bringing out about benefit risk as a prototype, if you will, for rare diseases. That by being out in front, we first help DMD patients, but can also help inform the thinking about other rare diseases. And what an opportunity to do that. So we're going to talk just a little bit more, and I'm about to Holly's section, but just thinking about what are the ways forward then. How do we use these meetings with FDA? How do we use the information that we've gathered about benefit and risk to move this process forward in the best interest of patients? So how do we do that? We have clear, consistent positions for advocacy going back to those 4 key policy objectives that began with the PPMD board and sustained to the present. Proactively engaging on policy issues, not just demanding change, but proposing positive change. Helping use evidence, benefit risk information, rare disease patient-reported outcomes, and so forth to help inform the thinking of FDA and others about what's important to patients that is specific and measurable, and using every opportunity to collaborate positively, what we have called assertive collaboration. And so taking the initiative plus having something concrete in hand, data, leads to progress. And if you will, what's in the name? Collaboration is the key. And if you look at the root words there, it is a labor of love and requires partnering. It recognizes that there are limited resources. How do we ration those resources and prioritize to the most important issues to the patient community? And then oration, how do we communicate this? And the process really is getting everybody on board. That's actually a real train with many people from a Far East country. First, folks need to get on board with what's a clear plan, and then need to progress to alignment. And that's really what PPMD has been doing, helping us transition to a building on the current processes, and this is my final slide, understanding what we can do in a policy environment that leads to an environment for action. How do we promote patient interests through our meetings with FDA and otherwise? How do we provide, by gathering data and then assessing it, new benefit risk approaches, and then move things forward? So this is PPMD's comprehensive, stepwise strategy to interweave these threads of action into something that is a strong rope for pulling through new advances. It's proactive. It's not waiting for an invitation. It's making our own invitation and delivering data that will compel others to really rethink their approaches. Because clearly FDA is being assailed by many forces of advocacy, by many rare diseases. How do we distinguish PPMD's efforts? And by providing valuable information, it can be transformational. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the speaking role over to Holly for further attention.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, here's my slide. So I'm Holly PA. If I haven't met you, I'm the Vice President of Education and Outreach at PPMD, and I'm very thrilled to tell you a bit about the RiskBenefit and Duchenne Therapies project. So this is the data that you've been hearing so much about. I'm going to give you a broad overview of how we did this survey, which was very complicated, and then what we found in the survey. So, again, just to reinforce, so you heard this from Dr. Franson, but the intent of this survey really was very much to inform the FDA as well as other stakeholders about the assessments of benefit and risk and the impact of Duchenne, and really intending to give the FDA the kind of data that they can use and that they will use in their review of their drug applications. The goal of the survey was to explore how parents and guardians of individuals with CMD prioritize risk and benefit in the context of new therapies. So there are a couple things just to notice in that first bullet. One of them is that this first set of data is limited to parents and guardians. And when I get to the end, I'll talk about next steps, but certainly we're very interested in getting information from, obviously, individuals with Duchenne muscular dystrophy themselves, as well as a broader set of the community. So this is a first step. So the other thing that I want you to notice in this first bullet is the idea of new therapies. So one of the things that is interesting but limiting in this survey is that these are hypothetical treatments. We presented treatments that were made up, although quite realistic. So I will point that out to you a couple times as we go through. You can see the aim here. We want to explore the treatment preferences, risk tolerance, and benefit priorities. We also are going to, this has not yet been done, but we're going to actually evaluate the effect of the child's disorder progression on treatment preferences. So we're going to look at different groups of kids based on whether their ambulation status and identify whether that affects the treatment priorities of the parents and guardians. We're also exploring Duchenne-related worries, and that's important for two reasons. So first is the FDA did ask for a broader context about the impact of these disorders on families and patients. And also, very practically, this was something that we were very happy to engage with the community on, and it was a part of the survey that we were confident was going to be successful. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. Okay, so this is where things get a bit technical, and I'm going to try to do this quickly and hopefully make it understandable to you. I would like to, again, recognize John Bridges, who is our collaborator at Johns Hopkins. We quickly realized that we were dealing with methodology that was quite unique and quite specialized, and John has been an excellent collaborator and has really provided us a great deal of insight. What this does is it uses something called best-worst scaling, and really the important thing to know there is that the intent of this is to make people make choices. So we intended to provide parents and guardians with treatments and with worries that included important aspects. And we wanted them all to be important. We didn't want to give anyone anything that wasn't important, but we wanted them to force people to make a choice. Among those important things, which one would you choose as best and worst, or which one would you choose as least or most worrying? And this is the approach that allows us to do that. In terms of creating the survey, so as you would imagine, if we're going to be giving people options and saying you have to pick the best and worst or the most and least important among these, if we don't give you the right things to pick from, we don't get good data out of it. So a big part of making these surveys successful is, of course, setting up the treatments or the worries so that they are valid and important to the community being tested. So I'll start with the worries, because that list was a bit less complex in terms of the development. We were very pleased to work with 5 parents who we invited to contribute a list of Duchenne-related worries. And we got very nice feedback from them, and what we were able to do then is actually refine those items and group them under very specific domains. And those domains are about the child's affect and emotion, the child's medical concerns, family and social issues, and the parent's well-being. So you can see it's a pretty broad set of worries. It's not intended to entail all worries, but it's intended to be a group of important worries for a large number of families. Creating the treatment survey part was quite complicated because we had to imagine realistic treatments, but on the other hand, we also had to present treatments that were balanced enough to allow a successful experiment. So there had to be true benefits but true risks, right? So we had to create something that we haven't actually seen in clinical trial yet. And that was, an interesting experience, and I think we've succeeded quite well in that, but I'll show you in a minute, and you all can make your own determinations. We started with a very large pool, and again, I think the important thing to note here is that there was a great deal of consultation along the way with parents, with healthcare providers who are experienced in clinical trials, and with biotech and pharmaceutical companies who informed us along this process and really helped us choose what we think are a good set of items that allowed us to have a successful experiment. We then piloted the survey, and I owe an incredible debt of gratitude to 7 parents who provided really quite extensive feedback on the items and on the survey as a whole. This was a very complicated survey. Those of you who took it, you are well aware of how complicated it was, and the piloting was really extremely important. We would not have had a successful survey without this. And the final survey was then implemented online. So how did the survey work? Now, I'm going to show you an example in a minute because this is a little bit hard to imagine. But what we first did was we told a story about the different treatments and the fact that they were treatments that had different levels of benefit and different levels of risk. And we walked people through those benefits and risks. And then we showed them an example so they had some idea what we wanted them to do. We then asked people to go through 18 different treatment choice tasks. Each of those questions was followed by an acceptability question, which was, if this treatment were real, would you use it for your child? And that's quite important in this sort of experiment because we could show people different variables involved with a treatment, and people would have to pick the thing they thought was best and worst about it, but they may be thinking the whole time to themselves, this is all well and good, but I would never use this treatment. I will do the experiment, but I would never use it. So that question allows us to get a feel for which treatments are more appealing to individuals. In terms of the worries, so we asked people to assess them over the past 7 days, and there were 16 different worry choice tasks. And let me show you what one of the tests looks like now. So here's an example from the treatment experiment. So we give people a different set of combinations in each one of the 18 different treatments, and we ask people to think through this different treatment. So for this one, this would be a treatment that would stop the progression of weakness. It would give a 5-year gain in expected lifespan. There's no post-approval drug information available. It causes a loss of appetite, but there's no increased risk of bleeding and no increased risk of heart arrhythmia. So you can see down the line that we have benefits and we have risks. And we ask people then to choose in each of the 18 different combinations what's the best and what's the worst thing. And participants did have to pick something to move on. So they were forced to answer each item. So that's how the experiment actually worked. For the worries, they got a list of worries and were asked to identify which one they were most worried about over the past 7 days and which one they were least worried about over the past 7 days. So here were the different variables that went into the experiment. For the treatments, you will see, I'm going to see my little cursor is working. So here we go. So these are what we call the attributes. This is sort of the bigger category. And the subcategory are called the levels. So the first attribute was muscle function, and the levels were stops or slows the progression of weakness or no change to the progression of weakness. You'll see that we did not offer something that looked like a cure. So we didn't say, it will fix your child's muscles, or we didn't say that your child will even gain in strength. It was a stopping or slowing of progression. Trying to keep this very realistic based on the things we're seeing right now in clinical trial and in the pipeline. We asked people to separate lifespan from muscle function, which was a bit of a challenge for some of the parents, but we, again, tried to set them up in the story to think about these things separately. And you can see there could be a 5-year gain, a 2-year gain, or no gain. Then we have something about knowledge. So how much do we know about the drug? And that could be 2 years of information or 1 year or no information after approval. The next slide will show you the risks. So the risks and side effects were nausea-related is the first one. And we have no increased chance or loss of appetite or loss of appetite with vomiting. Then we have a bleed-related attribute, which is no increased chance of bleeding gums and bruising, and increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke and lifelong disability. So you see there's a quite severe risk here. And arrhythmia is the final one. So we have no increased risk of heart arrhythmia, increased risk of what we term harmless heart arrhythmia, and then another severe risk, which is increased risk of dangerous heart arrhythmia and sudden death. So those were all of the different items that we shuffled around. And I say shuffled around, although, of course, it was quite a scientific method that we used to do that, and allowed 18 different representations of these levels that are statistically valid and allow individuals who are doing the experiment not to have to do every single combination of these levels. Okay? I'm going to quickly show you the worry list, and then I'll show you how these things actually came out in the experiment. Okay, so here's the list of worries, and I do see a couple questions coming through about the worry. So you can see one of them is financial burden in here, and there is indeed a financial item, but you can see there are a couple, there are different items about child's treatment, so my child missing out on new treatment, my child getting weaker, getting the right care for my child over time. Then there are also issues of the child's emotion, like my child feeling happy and having good friends. We also have issues for the whole family, so there are things about the effect, the well-being of my other children and affording the care my child needs within the family budget. So there are lots of different potential worries in this list. And again, these worries came from engagement with families. Okay, so let me show you, here we go. In terms of who was invited to participate, we did recruit through PPMD, Duchenne Connect, and snowball recruiting, which means that people tell other people, and, there was some social media, for example, about this. People who were invited to participate were parents or guardians who had at least one child with Duchenne who was living in the United States, and we chose the United States for this because, indeed, we're trying to inform the FDA. So, down the road, we'd like to maybe open that up a bit. And it was an online survey in English. And this study was exempted by the Western IRB, which is important because we'd like to be able to publish this data. So that's an important step for us. So let me tell you the results. We had 119 parents who completed the entire survey. And if you're one of those parents, I cannot thank you enough. This was quite a difficult survey, I think, for many people, and it took quite a long time. And we owe you an incredible debt of gratitude for completing the survey. The average age of the participant was about 44, and the average age of the child was about 12. One of the things that we would like to be able to address down the road is the fact that most of these participants were mothers, were Caucasian, married, and highly educated. And this is something that you typically do see in survey research, but we'd like, if we are able to participate in the next step, we'd like to be able to get a more varied sociodemographic background in the next survey. In terms of the children, most of them had one affected child, which is not surprising. One of the things that I think is quite interesting is that we do see a high level of people in this survey who have participated in clinical research and in clinical trial. That's actually interesting because these are perhaps the people who have, thought most about these issues. But again, it's something that down the road we'd like to be able to compare them to people who have less experience. And about 20% of these participants have had a child who has experienced a life-threatening emergency, and that caused the parent to worry the child would die. And I think this is interesting because you might anticipate that people's tolerance for risk might vary based on these sorts of experiences in their children. I know this slide is a bit difficult to read, and I'm showing this primarily because there's a lot of interest. I know probably there are folks on participating in the webinar who are from industry or clinicians, and they're quite interested in how we're defining the child's physical ability. So this is one of the ways we defined it. I think the take home here that was important to us is we have a range of ability in this research group. So we have children who are toddlers, and they're really, in fact, too young to walk far yet, all the way to folks who are unable to control their wheelchair without help. And that's important because we do want to have a good feel for how the broader community feels about these issues. Come on, cursor. Okay. So in terms of the treatment experiment, the whole survey worked. So that was really good news because one of the things that can happen in these surveys is that people, they refuse. So the survey fails because participants sort of refuse to engage, and that would not in any way mean that participants were not willing. That would mean that we did not set up the survey in a way that was acceptable or allowed them to show their preferences. But it was very good because we actually have very nice data showing the survey did work, and people do have preferences, and that, it was good. So it was a successful survey, which is very good. In terms of the attribute importance, so remember the attributes are the big categories. This little pie chart shows you how people found the importance of these items relative to each other. So the biggest piece of the pie is weakness. So those are the items about stopping or slowing the progression of weakness. So this was what drove the majority of the treatment preferences, okay? So people really wanted that weakness benefit to slow or stop progression. But you can see that the two big risks were in arrhythmia and bleeding, and those were important as well. Right? And lifespan is important too, but not nearly as important as weakness in terms of how parents made their prioritization for these treatments. So overall, what this is suggesting to us is that weakness is driving the decisions, and that people would, in fact, be willing to accept one serious risk for something that slows or stops progression of weakness, but they wouldn't accept all the risk. Okay, and I'll show you a little more data that helps reinforce that. So I know this is a complicated slide and quite difficult, so all I'm going to ask you to do is just notice a few things, okay? So this is muscle weakness, and this is arrhythmia and bleed risk. So these are the ones I showed you on the pie that took up the majority of the colored space. These are the results from the conditional logistical regression, which most of you probably say, oh my gosh, I'd like to never hear that word again, so I won't say it again. But this was the method we used to do the sophisticated analysis. So the important thing on here is that this muscle weakness takes up the largest line, right? So we have the biggest line here. This is the one that was indeed the largest in terms of prioritization. And the thing that's interesting here is that this is the item of no change to muscle function. And this was the one that people actually perceived as the worst. So the best was this stopping and slowing progression, and the worst was no change to muscle function, again, driving the fact that muscle weakness was really what was the main prioritization for the treatments. However, again, the bleeds and the arrhythmia were quite important, quite important to people. The post-market data and the nausea and vomiting was much less important in terms of people's prioritization. And again, life expectancy was not nearly as important as muscle weakness. Okay? And I'm hoping that many of the parents in the audience are saying, okay, that sounds right. I mean, really, this should be something that most of you say, okay, that sounds right. I'd like to hear from you either way, so please do feel free to let me know what you think about this data. I'm quite interested in your thoughts on it. In terms of the worry experiment, the most significant worry was, number 1, my child getting weaker. Number 2 was getting the right care for my child over time. Number 3 was missing out on new treatments. So the top 3 are very related to child's care. You can see that also the child's affect and my child feeling happy was important, managing the parent's uncertainty, and then the affording care that the child needs within the family budget. Those were the 6 most important worries. The least prioritized worry was having time for myself. Now, again, I want to reiterate for all of this data, this is not the parents who took the survey saying the other things are not important. We made them make choices, and a lot of what the feedback we got was we didn't like to make those choices. We want all of it, right? And so we had to really force people, and so I do want to just make sure that no one leaves this webinar with the feeling that, having time for myself is not important, or that, going back to this slide, that, life expectancy, post-marketing data, nausea, and vomiting are not important. What that shows is they're less important among important items, all right? So I just want to make sure that's clear to people because I don't want to give you the wrong impression. Okay, so the conclusions within the context of our experiment, and this is important because, again, people can only respond to the items that we gave them. So within the context of the experiment we set up, worries related to the child's illness, progression, and care were the ones that accounted for the largest proportion of variance, which is the proper way of saying that these were the things that really sort of drove the worst of the worries. Again, stopping and slowing progression, the same thing, drove the majority of the preferences in treatment, and that the presence of side effects or risks could be compensated for by a treatment that slows or stops the progression. So people are willing to accept side effects and risks if we give them a treatment that stops or slows progression. But parents have a limit to their risk tolerance. So parents were not willing to accept all of the worst risks for the benefits that we gave them, all right? So people are carefully making choices about benefit risk and are not willing to accept all the risks, all right? So I'm going to tell you, I see several questions coming up, so I'm going to actually go to 1 or 2 of them. Ryan, is that okay if I go before I move on? Do you mind?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Just to make sure I do them while they're coming in. So a couple of people have talked a little bit about the issue of life expectancy versus weakness, and this was indeed something that was an issue, and we really set people up for this. So we did ask people very concretely to pull apart muscle function and life expectancy. We even gave them an example in the setup. In the story we told them was, something like, for example, there could be something that helped your child's skeletal muscles but did not affect the heart, and so had no effect on the child's life expectancy. So we tried very hard to make them think about those 2 things differently. I know that was difficult, but again, the survey actually worked very well. So we have evidence that people did do it even though they didn't want to do it, okay? So I know that a couple of people have put in questions like that, and I will say you're not the only ones. There are also several questions about why particular side effects were not included. And again, we started with a very big group of attributes, and they included quite a lot of potential risks. And we chose the risks that we chose were for a number of reasons, both practical and, mostly practical, actually. So what we needed risks that people could understand. So if we talked about something that we had to spend a half page describing, that's no good. And so we needed something that, that we could make concrete to people. And we also needed things that were relevant, so that parents would look at them, for example, one of the reasons we picked arrhythmia is that that is something that parents told us is something that they think about, right? It's a relevant item in them thinking about their care of their child over time. So those were the reasons for the choice. If we move on and do another survey, we very well may choose different risks, or we may add more potential risk to the category, all right? There are also some specific questions that I'll answer offline, but this has been very helpful to see what kind of questions. And one more interesting one just came in was, did we quantify the risk? And that is a very good question. And in this first survey, we did not quantify the risks. And there are lots of practical, again, reasons because people have trouble with that, but more we did that for methodological reasons. And it may be that in the next step that we do a survey that does include numbers in it. All right. So I see more questions, but to make sure we stay on time, I'm going to tell about another thing that we're doing as well in the meantime. That's a Tell Your Story project, which is adding the community voice into the survey. So that this data sometimes feels very dry, and it is important to try to keep our voice in this whole process. And so we have a place on our website, it's still live if you'd like to participate, where we ask people to tell their story. And if you had a chance to talk to the FDA, what would you want them to know? And this would be data that could be provided by, parents, by individuals with Duchenne, muscular dystrophy, by other relatives, clinicians, right? There's lots of ways you can participate. And the three main themes that we've identified from the first 64 participants was that time is running out, flexibility is important, and some risk is tolerable, and individuals should have the choice. Those were the three recurring themes, and I'll just show you some examples of some quotes. In terms of time is running out, one of our participants said, all of us parents know what the outcome is if we don't try something. I beg you to fast-track drugs and treatments through the Duchenne pipeline. Time is something our boys do not have. So, these were themes that we heard from a lot of the parents, this sort of, pressure of having a progressive disease. The next one is, if I can get the slide, here we go, flexibility is important. So really asking the FDA to consider more flexibility in their processes. And one of the quotes was, unfortunately, we don't see the FDA as an organization that protects us from harmful products or treatments, but we see them as an obstacle to progress. An obstacle to treatment being developed in time for my son so he does not have to become a statistic of lives lost to DMD. Finally, the last strong theme was the idea, again, consistent with this survey, is that some risk is tolerable, and people should be able to make those choices. Families talking together, talking with their healthcare providers, they should be able to decide how much risk they're willing to tolerate for a particular level of benefit. And I have two quotes here, and I'll just read the first one in reference to time. And it says, when it comes to terminal illnesses, the FDA's job should be to make sure the product is safe and that the risks and benefits presented by the producer are accurate. Our job should be to determine, given all that information, whether to give it to our children. It's an intensely personal decision that involves the parents and the child with Duchenne. So, again, the idea that people should be allowed to have more of a say in how much risk to accept for particular levels of benefit. So next steps. So our next step, I have possible in front of there because, some of this depends on the engagement. So, Dr. Franson talked quite a bit about how we're doing this engagement, this aggressive collaboration, and we are waiting to hear back from them, and we, in fact, have a meeting planned for later in the summer about how they find this data. Is it what they want? Do they want to see it in a different way, right? So we're really interested in that feedback from them so we can make sure we're doing the next step in a way that really does inform their deliberations. What we're hoping that will happen is that we will refine the survey items and do a second survey that's of a larger, more representative group, right? So we need more people, like I said before, of a broader socioeconomic group. We also really would want to hear from people with Duchenne because maybe people with Duchenne feel differently than their parents do, and that would be important information to know. And we need the continued engagement with regulators, industry, and clinicians about which items to include and why, and do that in a very systematic way so we can build from these first results and continue to make sure we're moving this discussion forward. Another very important step is going to be publishing this data. I know I mentioned that before. Publishing is extremely important in terms of making the FDA pay attention to this data because that level of peer review, but also it's an important step for the community as a whole and for this ability to get a broad audience to pay attention to these efforts to really well define how much benefit and how much risk families are willing to tolerate for particular treatments. Okay. As well, the Tell Your Story collection is ongoing, and I see someone has asked for the link to that. And, Ryan, I apologize. I did forget to put that on my slide, so maybe that's something we could either do at the end or we could
yeah, I can actually email all the participants. It's our website //Tell Your Story. But, again, I will make sure to email it out to everybody.
And, what I'm hoping will happen as well if we do a next survey is that everyone on this call who was not participated in the first survey, or even if you did, would be willing to do a second survey. It is a big ask because it was quite a bit of effort to engage in that survey. So I'm very hopeful that, we'll have a very good response the second time around as we did the first time around. So to end this discussion, I do, again, want to thank the collaborators. There are actually quite a few more who are not on the slide, but the people who've been quite involved are, of course, again, our colleague John Bridges. For those of you who are coming to the Connect conference in just a couple weeks in Baltimore, Dr. Bridges will be there, and I think it'll be a nice way he's going to present with me, so it'll be a nice way for him to give his perspective as well as for people who would like to ask him questions about the methodology. He's very willing to engage and interested in engaging. Eileen Holland has actually been very involved with the analysis as well, and Sharon Hesterly and Hadar Shuffer from PPMD have been quite involved as well. So thank you, of course, Pat on the phone, as well as myself and Ryan. So all of us who are involved from PP in the webinar have been very involved as well. So I'm going to end my comments there and open it up for questions. Ryan, do you want to start the question and answer session?
Sure. We had a few come in earlier that we weren't able to address. One in particular, why were kidney and liver damage not included in the risk category?
Right. So that was part of, again, this idea that we had a very large number and we had to refine them. And kidney and liver were both quite difficult to describe, and that was a big part of why. We had to make choices. We had to limit ourselves to the two risks and the one side effect, and we just ended up feeling like the arrhythmia and the bleeds were things that we could explain to people in a way that made sense. We had to be able to have 3 levels, and that was quite difficult with both liver and kidney. To have that moderate level was quite hard, and it was very hard to describe. So those were the reasons. It's not that there weren't lots of other potential risks that we could have presented, but again, we had to find things that matched the way we set up the survey.
Okay, great. There was a few questions on timelines for publication, which I know is a tough one to answer.
That is a tough one to answer. I will say, it's always it's easy to be overly optimistic about timelines for publication. On the team of us, we are working on publications right now while we're finishing the analysis. So we're trying to move this very quickly. But publications take a while. The peer review process takes quite a long time. So realistically, I don't think the publications will be available until the end of the calendar year at best. However, we have been successful at submitting abstracts from this study for several major conferences that healthcare providers and policymakers attend. And so we will be presenting this data broadly before the publication occurs. And I've also been presenting the data in the meantime to industry. So we are getting the data out there in very systematic ways as well as the publication. I wish the timeline was faster. It's just unfortunately it's a slow process. The peer review process is not fast.
Great, thank you. There was a question, is the bleeding risks from the meds or from the DMD?
We set the bleeding risk to be from the medication. So there was the thing that I couldn't show you on this presentation is the story. So we really very carefully walked people through a story of what each of these items mean, and we did very clearly indicate that the risks were from the medication use.
Okay. And finally, would it be worthwhile to do an exon skipping specific risk-benefit survey?
Yes, so that's a very interesting question, and it's not just exon skipping. There's some interest in doing follow-on surveys that would model different types of therapies, and that methodologically is very challenging, but it's something that has come up many times of could you make one that looks like this, or could you make one that looks like this? And, again, for very practical reasons, to really understand how acceptable things that are either in clinical trial or in the pipeline are to the community. And that is a big part of the discussion of next steps and a big part of the reason why we need to continue to engage with industry as well as regulators as we go. So it's a great question, and it might be possible and certainly is worthwhile. The question is, how possible is it to do in the context of our overall goals? Great question.
Wonderful. We had a question, will this be sent to the FDA? If you could, actually, I can chime in on that. Some of this has already been shown to the FDA. We participated in a meeting with the Every Life Foundation on accelerated approval where Pat presented some of this data. But, Holly, if you want to speak to future plans, that would be great.
No, absolutely. We're trying to engage with the FDA through actually several different mechanisms, but the most, I think the most direct and most promising is an upcoming meeting for the summer where we will lay out these data very concretely and show them really all as much detail as they want. And our colleague John Bridges will be at that meeting as well. So that will be a chance to really, we don't just want to send them the data. We want them to tell us, is this what you want? Or how could we change this to make it what you want? And so that level of engagement is very important, and that's what we're striving for.
Okay, great. Okay, everybody, I know we went a little bit over. Just to reiterate some of the themes and some of what Pat has said, that, we're trying to be thoughtful in how we engage the FDA on explaining to them the unmet medical need, and where doing nothing essentially is doing harm. In the coming weeks, you're going to hear more from us on our DTAP initiative. We hope that this webinar was a chance for you to really understand the importance of BenefitRisk and our effort to collect this data that will be helpful to regulators. When more opportunities come up for you to participate, we will, of course, put that out there. For now, we do encourage everyone to participate in the Tell Your Story survey, which we're continuing to compile, and we're going to be having on some sort of public forum as well. So with that, Tim or Holly, if you have anything else to add, or Pat?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. This is really an important and critical conversation that we have together so that we can inform the FDA, because it doesn't matter the stage of the disease. It matters that all boys have access to opportunities that exist to change the progression, and that's what we want to do. If we had our way, we'd have all these drugs approved yesterday if they were safe and effective. So thank you so much for joining us, and you'll hear more in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Holly. Thanks, Rye.
Pleasure.